I've heard from folks who stepped up to me on the streets, after committee, in the committee hearings, that marriage is a sacred institution and therefore should be defined by terms of a sacred compact with God. They also seem to oftentimes note that I should be reading Leviticus as a particular chapter of the Bible that speaks to the reasons why this law is necessary. And then oftentimes they end their conversation with, and I know this because Jesus is Lord. I must admit that last argument is one that's very difficult to argue against. I generally don't try and argue matters of faith with people. I think that is between them and their God, and I try and keep their God out of our laws as often as possible. The problem with this, though, is that we are blurring the sacred and the profane here. If we are in keeping with this idea that we're going to blur the line and bring them together, I would ask if we're going to use the Bible and Leviticus specifically to legislate, what other biblical laws should we in fact be invoking? One that comes personally to mind is Leviticus 25, 44 through 46. Your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. You may also buy some of the temporary residents living among you and members of their clans born in your country, and can make them slaves for life. I'm not comfortable with using Leviticus as the basis for my law. If we're going to use one definition out of Leviticus, I'm not sure that at some point someone might not decide to use another definition, and that would definitely have an effect on me. Now, this bill also reminds me of an earlier time in my life when laws very similar to this did have a direct and profound effect on my life. I was leaving college, graduating college, and I was engaged to a young woman from New Hampshire who was not of the same race as I am. And we were trying to decide where we were going to start our family. And we thought about, where would we want to live? We were not going to stay in New Hampshire because there was no money in New Hampshire. We were going to move someplace, and where would that be? And an entire section of the country was basically off limits to us at that time. Why? Because that section of the country had miscegenation laws. They had laws that banned marriage between a black man and a white woman. And so we basically discounted almost the entire southeast and southwest of the country because we simply could not be married in many of those states and didn't want to go through the hassle there. Now, some would say, well, that's just simply an archaic law. The reality is those laws were still in the books up until 2000 when Alabama finally got rid of their last miscegenation law. But I guess I would still ask the question, why are we following in that line? Because I really do believe this does follow in that same line. And to give you an example of that, this is not the first constitutional amendment about marriage. In 1923, a U.S. senator by the name of Capper from Kansas proposed a constitutional amendment to define marriage. Now, in this case, his definition, he was head of the marriage block of the U.S. Senate. But his law or amendment would have said that marriage is only between a white man and a white woman. It would have banned marriage between the races on a constitutional basis. Now, some have said that was clearly never going to happen, that couldn't have happened. And in fact, the U.S. Supreme Court has in fact ruled on this already. In Lovey versus Virginia, they made the note that there is a right to marriage. And I know some in the committee said they didn't think there was any right to marriage, but in fact the U.S. Supreme Court has in fact recognized the right to marriage. In a unanimous decision, the court wrote, "Marriage is one of the basic civil rights of man, fundamental to our very existence and survival. To deny this fundamental freedom on so unsupportable a 14th basis is a directly subversive to the principles of equality that are at the heart of the 14th Amendment, and is surely to deprive all the state citizens of liberty without due process of law." I would ask the authors and this body, do we want to be the Senator Cappers of our day? Do we want to be the purveyors of hate and divisiveness, or do we want to reflect the values of the Supreme Court, that our laws should be a reflection of the Declaration of Independence that promotes life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? I would argue that this bill does not befit this body and our values. Our charge is to work in the profane world of men and laws. If this bill is not of the sacred, which would be clearly not allowable under the separation of church and state, then I would argue that in its broadest sense, this amendment is profane.